Hello class, today we're going to talk about solving proportions. The reason why we're doing this is because our standards say that we're going to talk about proportionality. It says that the student applies mathematical process standards to represent and solve problems involving proportional relationships. So we're going to solve problems involving ratios, rates, and even percents, including multi-step problems as we progress through this unit. But the reason why we're doing this is because we're solving problems involving proportional relationships. So that's why we have to learn to solve proportions. Okay? So today we're going to spend time looking at the mechanics of solving proportions. So let's look at it. Okay? So the way we solve a proportion, and we know that a proportion is one ratio that's equal to another ratio, is we look at what we call the cross products. So if I take the products of A and D and the products of B and C, they should equal each other if it is a proportion. For example, if I have 6 over 9 and 8 over 12, if I multiply 12 times 6, I'm going to get 72. If I multiply 9 times 8, I'm also going to get 72. So a little bit later in the lesson, we're going to try to determine, are these two ratios equal? And if the cross products are equal, then the ratios are equal. So it makes a proportion. If we look at it algebraically, it's A times D and B times C. They have to be equal to each other. So that's what we're going to be looking at today, solving proportions. So let's look at one. The proportion we have is x over 9 is equal to 4 over 6. Well, in the previous example, we were just trying to determine were the proportions equal to each other. In this one, we're trying to determine what piece is missing so that it makes these two ratios equal to each other. So the way we do that is we look at their cross products. So we have x over 9 is equal to 4 over 6. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this 6 and we're going to cross multiply it with the x. And so 6 times x gives us just 6x equals. We're going to do the same thing to the other two. 9 times 4 gives us 36. Now what you'll find is that when you do that, you're left with an equation, just a simple one-step equation. So here I have a multiply by 6. So how do we get rid of that? We do a divide by 6. And we end up with x is equal to, well, 36 divided by 6 is 6. So the value that I could plug into this x to make these two ratios true is a 6. So 6 over 9 is equal to 4 over 6. And if we test it like we did in the previous example, 9 times 4 is 36. 6 times 6 is 36. So that shows that those two ratios are equal. So let's do a few more real quick. Let's do one more together, and then I'll have you do two by yourself, and then we'll come back and look at that. So let's look at A together. So this one I'm going to take the 3 and the h and cross multiply. So that's going to give me 3h is equal to, now I'm going to take the 2 and the 9, cross multiply those to get 18. Now I need to solve for h, so I divide both sides by 3, and I end up with h equaling 6. Now, if you'll notice in the other two examples, my letter changes spots. That's okay. You still do exactly the same thing. You cross multiply. So pause the video and answer those two questions. Okay, let's see how you did. So on B, we're going to take the 5 and the t, we'll cross multiply those. Now, you'll notice that it crosses over here onto the right-hand side. So 5t really is over here on the right of the equal sign, is equal to. Now we do the same thing with the 55 and the 4, and we multiply those together. Well, that's a little bit bigger number than I want to do in my head, so I'm going to get my calculator out to help me. Okay, so 55, did too many 5s there, 55 times 4 gives me 220. So 220. Now I need to still solve for t, so I'm going to divide both sides by 5. And t is equal to, well, if we get our calculator again, we take the 220 and we divide that by 5. We come up with 44. So we end up with t equaling 44. Now, on both of these, you could probably figure out another way of doing this one. You'll notice that, how did I go from 3 to 9? Well, I multiplied by 3, so I do the same thing to the top. 2 times 3 gives us 6. This one, how did I go from 5 to 55? I multiply by 11. So 4 times 11 gives us 44. So in both of those are pretty simple to do. But in this one, how would I go from 6 to 22? I'm not really sure. So that's another reason why we need to use the proportion format to solve these. So I'm going to cross multiply the 21 and the 22. Again, I'm going to get my calculator out. 22 times 21 gives us 462 is equal to, and now d times 6 gives us 6d. Divide both sides by 6, and d is equal to, I'll get my calculator back out, 426 divided by 6 gives me 77 as my answer. So to solve proportions, they're pretty simple. You just cross multiply, and then we divide by the number that's with our letter, which we call a coefficient. Well, another reason why we need to know how to use proportions is like we did at the very beginning, we can determine whether or not two ratios are equal to each other. Do they form a proportion? So in order for this to be a proportion, the 14 times 4 have to equal, and the 6 times 10 have to equal each other. So let's see if they do. Well, 14 times 4, well, I need a calculator for that again, so I'm going to get that out. And I do 14 times 4, we come up with 56. So the cross products of 14 and 4 are 56, and 6 times 10 gives us 60. So are those two cross products equal? And they're not. So that tells us that this does not make a proportion. If it would make a proportion, then these two values would be equal. Right? And that's what this page right here says. That in order for you to determine whether or not it's a proportion, we find the two cross products and we see if they're equal to each other. If they are, then it is a proportion. If they're not, it's not a proportion. So let's do a couple of those real fast just to test our abilities, test what we learned. So on A right here, it says we've got 6 over 9 and 4 over 6, and we're trying to determine are they equal. So 6 times 6 is 36, 9 times 4 is 36. Does this make a proportion? Yes, it does. Okay. B, you got 15 over 20 and 5 over 7. Okay, well, the 20 and 5 I can do pretty easy. 20 times 5 gives me 100. But 7 times 15, well, I know 7 and 5 is going to give me a 35. So this actually gives me 105 for my answer. So does this make a proportion? No, it does not. It does not make one. Okay, you do the last one on your own. You check to see if it will make a proportion. Pause the video and answer the question. Okay, let's see how you did. So we've got 7 over 12 and 17.5 over 30. Okay, so I'm going to take the 30 and the 7, multiply that together, and get 210. I'm going to take the 12 and 17.5. We'll get my calculator out for that one. 12 times 17.5 equals, and we end up with 210. So does this make a proportion? Yes, it does. Okay. We got one last thing to talk about with proportions, and then we'll end this lesson today. Okay. And that is the real world application. Proportions are going to be one of those problems that you will actually use in the real world at some point in time. Now, you may not use it the same way that we use it in this problem here, but you will use them. So here is a problem that I want us to look at. It says 100 nautical miles equals about 115 standard or statute miles. How many standard miles equal 156 nautical miles? Round your answer to the nearest whole number. Well, when you're given a word problem, what we're looking for is a ratio that I know and a ratio that I'm looking for. So in this particular problem, it says that 100 nautical miles equals about 150 standard miles. That's a ratio I can count on. So I write that down. 100 nautical miles is the same thing as 115 standard miles. So when I'm setting up a proportion, if I set it up as nautical over standard, the other side has to have the same labels. Nautical miles over standard miles. Okay? Now I could set it up any which way I wanted to, but as long as my labels match, everything works fine. So the question then says, how many standard miles is equal to 156 nautical miles? So that 156 is a nautical mile. So that means it's going to go on top, and I'm looking for standard miles. Now that we've set up our proportion, we solve just like we have been doing. So I take the x and cross multiply it with the 100. I get 100x is equal to, I take the 115 and the 156, I cross multiply those, 115 times 156. We end up with 17,940, and then I divide both sides by 100. And I end up with x equaling 179.40. Now it says, round your answer to the nearest whole number. So this 4, is it big enough to do anything to the 9? No, it's not. It has to be 5 or more. So my answer is just 179 standard miles. So our answer would be C. So what we've looked at today is solving proportions. And we find that all we have to do to solve a proportion is cross multiply and then divide by the coefficient. Until next time.